How can you change these into this? Join me today as I make sloe ink. My name's Liz Chadderton. I'm a watercolour artist based in Berkshire, and I share tips and tricks that I wish I'd known about ages ago. I love being out in nature, and I often come home with my pockets full of treasures. I've been making walnut ink, acorn ink, iron gall ink, and today I want to make sloe ink. And if you stay to the end, I'll share some very strange colour changing properties that I've discovered about this ink. Sloes are just little wild plums. It's pretty late in the season to be able to pick them, but it was such a good season there may be some left over. Usually I would say November, December after a decent frost. People sometimes say, just buy the ink from a shop. Well, I love to be out in nature. I like to be connected with artists through history, and it's fascinating. It's a pretty rainy day outside, so it's perfect for making lotions and potions inside. You need sloes, obviously. Pick them after the first frost because it releases all the juice. If you're too impatient, of course, you could pick your sloes and put them in the freezer, and it sort of breaks down the cell structure. They need washing to get rid of creepy crawlies, mud, and whatever. We'll need an old pot that you do not use for food. We need some white vinegar because that will help with the preserving. Some gum arabic if you've got it, because that is a binder that you put into things like watercolours and inks. It helps the flow, it helps binding to the paper. You might want a little salt, that also can help with the preserving. Some recipes suggest alum, which is a mordant. That's the technical term. Again, that helps with the binding. A mordant is something that binds a dye to a fabric, but it will help with the binding to the paper. I have ordered some alum. I am waiting for it to be delivered. Alum is an aluminium salt. I tried our local pharmacies, they didn't have it. But if you have an Asian or an Indian shop near you, it is fatakti, and you might be able to get it there because it's used in pickling. Oh, and we'll need a bottle to put our ink in. I happen to have this from ink that had congealed. So I washed it out and I've got that. A brown one would be even better because that helps against sort of light stability. Wash those, take out anything really gummy. And pop in your pan. Then put in about half the volume again of water. And we're going to boil that for about half an hour. So that's just on the stove coming to a boil. You could mash it up a little to start releasing the juice. These have been through multiple frosts. We've just had a really, really cold spell. And I say I was really surprised they were even on the trees still. Seeing already some of that red colour is coming out, and I'm thinking it will end up a beautiful ruby colour. When you boil it, it's a very gentle simmer. If I was a patient woman, which I'm not, this would be great to do in a slow cooker. If you happen to have an old slow cooker you could use, because it would just give a really gentle heat over, say, I don't know, 6-7 hours, and it would release all those juices. But I'm excited to get going. For once, this actually smells quite nice, certainly a lot better than acorn or walnut ink. And you can see it's got a beautiful red colour. So that's 30 minutes, and I will turn that off. The next thing we have to do is strain out all the pips and skins and goodness knows what. So I've got a sieve and I've got a very old cheesecloth, and you can see I have obviously used this for other things. I think that was walnut ink. An alternative would be something like a coffee filter. I'll let that drain and cool down, then we'll squeeze it out. This has been dripping for ages, and I'm just going to do that final squeeze to get the last bit of moisture out. All that pulp can go into our compost bin. So I want to see what it's looking like. And that's the colour at the moment, which is really pretty. I suspect that as it dries, it will go duller and probably more purple. I would like it darker than this, so I am going to evaporate off maybe half of that. I don't want it to become like syrup, but I reckon if I pour this back into my pan, which didn't get stained, I was quite surprised. Anyway, pour it back in there and put it on a super low heat. It'll evaporate off, and then I can add all the extra bits because I am still waiting for my alum to arrive. I evaporated off the ink, and frankly, I think I went a bit too far because it almost feels a little bit jammy. Let's very quickly see what it looks like on this is a piece of watercolour paper, and that's as dark as it's gone in its slightly jammy stage. Nothing has been added at this point, but now I'm going to pop in some gum arabic. You can get gum arabic solution or indeed powder, and gum arabic is the binder that we put into watercolour. So this should help with flow and binding on the paper. So I'm putting a teaspoon in at the moment. My recipe suggested actually a tablespoon, but that seems an awful lot for what I've got here. Why don't I try a dip pen and see how it writes? Well, it seems to write through the pen, so that's good. Yeah, that seems to write. It'll be interesting how it dries. My recipe suggested adding alum powder, which I think I mentioned earlier you can find in some Indian shops as fitkari, and it's turned up, so let's see what it's like. So it's a white powder and it's potassium aluminium sulfate. The recipe suggested a teaspoon of this, but again I am going to start with a half teaspoon. And this is what we've called the mordant that helps it bind as an ink. So let's add a little of that and see what that feels like. I don't know if it'll change the colour. My only slight concern is that I think it is mildly acidic, which may not do my paper any good. The other thing that was suggested was potentially to add a little vinegar as a preservative. Now vinegar will again acidify this, but I also wondered if it might help get rid of some of that jamminess. I put a teaspoon in there. I don't want this to smell disgusting while I'm using it. I think it's going to be a matter of trial and error. Until you get something that you're happy with how it works. The final thing that was suggested is putting it in a clove or two when you put it in the bottle, because that acts as a preservative. If you have some essential oils like wintergreen or thyme essential oil, a little drop of that can just stop any mold forming. Let's decant it into our bottle. Pop in a couple of cloves. And now the best thing we can do is actually use it, I reckon. Got a little Lightwish hot press watercolour pad, and I've just put some tape round to give me some nice clean edges. So let's give this a good test. I am going to test it out with both brush and a dip pen and just, well, see how it behaves. I've obviously sped this up considerably. So with the paper wet, I'm dropping in the ink to see how it travels through, and I'm getting some really nice marks coming down as it wiggles down the page. Put in a horizon, put in a bit of a diagonal and then a bit of spatter, dried it off and then grabbed my dip pen again to put in trunks and tracery for very distant trees. Say this is an imagined landscape just to put the ink through as many different processes as I can think of. I do wish the tone was a bit darker, so I'll keep adding ink and layering it to try and have everything from just a pale tint to a really dark tone. I'm liking how it's going through the dip pen, so I put that fence in and that was all nice. Then I'm going to try and have blocks of darker area and keep mixing and matching to build up the suggestion of a bit of detail. So I'm putting some branches and brambles and whatever in with the pen here. Obviously, I have no idea at this point about the longevity of the ink, whether it will fade in light, but you know, I just want to play, and it reminds me of a nice walk in the countryside. That was my thicker dip pen, just so I can vary the marks and bring them forward on the page. So this is some sort of dead dry grass. I'm now using a continuous line to put in seed heads and a bit of texture in the foreground and leaves and thinner jumble of stalks and all that sort of stuff. Really, it's playtime just to use this little imagined landscape. And I'm working backwards and forwards over the picture. Now that the background is a bit drier, I can go back and put in some extra trunks and thicken things up. I thought that fence was looking a bit weedy, wouldn't have kept any cows or sheep out of the field, would it? So just strengthen that up. Whoops, put a blob, so just take that off. But actually I rather like the idea of a few blobs and stones in the foreground. And when it's dry, it's just time to take that tape off, which can be transformational. Well, it is fun to work with, and I'm going to leave that now just to see what the colour shift is, because this that I tested out, what, 20 minutes ago, which isn't dry, but look how it's shifted to the blue already. And I wonder whether this will, or whether because I've used the hairdryer on it and sort of warmed it, whether it won't. Don't know. And as always, there's only one way to find out. Having taken that border off, do you know, I think I'm going to do some very fine lines here just to extend it. Welcome back. This is the next day and I am surprised. I was expecting this to have turned blue. Look, the samples I put on this pad all turned blue. Why has this stayed the lovely plummy colour? So I've investigated and I think the ink is interacting with the paper. This is a nice quality cotton paper. This was a very nasty quality cellulose paper. And then these are two more samples. That's Bockingford, also a cellulose paper. Hasn't gone as blue as that, but definitely bluer than that. And this was a little bit of Meaden paper, which I thought was cotton, but we've got a really big blue shift again. Again, not quite as blue as that. So this ink is really rather clever. I did one other thing while we were exploring, and I put some of the ink on a piece of Bockingford paper, tested whether it lifted, and it did lift very easily. I then ironed it. I ironed it a little bit, and I ironed it a lot of it. You can see how dark it's gone on a very hot setting. I haven't burnt the paper because it's like, oh, did I burn it? No, because look, paper is not burnt. And then again, I tested whether it was waterproof. So here, it still lifted when I'd ironed it a little bit. Here, it is totally waterproof. Please, if you're a chemist and can work out some of what's going on, I'd love to know, because we've got this ink that colour shifts on some papers, totally changes colour with heat setting and becomes waterproof. Fascinating. It smells lovely. It is a beautiful colour with that potential for colour shifting. It's not quite as dark in tone as I thought. And this is very jammy. The jamminess, I think, was down to my impatience. I boiled it too hard and too fast to get evaporation. Don't be like me. If you want to get it darker, let it evaporate naturally and you won't end up painting with jam.